Where do you think I'm watching this mystery unfold from? Tell me in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more twists like this. Chapter 1. The Bell That Should Not Have Rung. The village of St. Ethelbury was the sort of place that appeared on postcards and in the memories of elderly people who insisted that England had once been kinder, quieter, and considerably more respectable. It nestled among gentle green hills, surrounded by hedgerows and narrow lanes bordered by foxgloves. The church stood at the heart of the village, as it had for nearly 500 years. Its ancient stone tower watched over cottages, gardens, and secrets with equal patience. On the morning of the summer fete, St. Ethelbury looked particularly charming. Colourful bunting fluttered from windows. Children chased one another across the village green. Tables groaned beneath homemade cakes, jars of jam, and raffle prizes donated by proud villagers. The church bell rang cheerfully at 10 o'clock. Nobody thought anything of it. By noon, however, people would remember that bell with a certain unease, for there was one curious fact. The bell should never have rung at all. Miss Marple sat beneath a striped tent, knitting a pale blue scarf despite the warm weather. Age had done nothing to diminish her alertness. Her faded eyes moved quietly from person to person, noticing details others overlooked. She observed Mrs. Finch, the baker's wife, who smiled warmly while secretly watching who bought cakes from her rival's stall. She observed young Peter Morton slipping away whenever his fiancée approached. She observed Reverend Julian Harcourt laughing politely at jokes that plainly irritated him. Human nature, Miss Marple often reflected, was remarkably consistent. The village might change, people never did. Beside her sat her old friend, Mrs. Bantry. "I do hope nothing dreadful happens today," said Mrs. Bantry. Miss Marple looked amused. "My dear Dolly, whenever anyone says that, something dreadful usually follows." Mrs. Bantry laughed. "You make it sound inevitable. Human beings make trouble inevitable." At the centre of the fete stood Sir Malcolm Ashcombe. He was the wealthiest man in St. Ethelbury, and owner of Ashcombe Hall, the grand manor overlooking the village. At 72, Sir Malcolm remained tall and imposing. His silver hair and commanding voice gave him an air of authority that many found impressive and others found unbearable. He was making a speech. Most of the villagers pretended to listen, and therefore Sir Malcolm declared, "I am pleased to announce a substantial donation toward restoring the church tower." Polite applause followed. The church tower was indeed in need of repair. Several stones had loosened over the years, and the ancient bell mechanism had become unreliable. The Reverend Harcourt stepped forward. "This generosity means a great deal to our parish." Sir Malcolm inclined his head graciously. Yet as he did so, his gaze settled briefly upon a man standing near the edge of the crowd. The man was Arthur Bellamy, a local historian, an unmarried gentleman of 55 who spent most of his life studying village records, church documents, and forgotten family histories. The look exchanged between the two men lasted only a second, yet it contained unmistakable hostility. Miss Marple noticed it. She also noticed Arthur Bellamy's expression afterward. Not anger, not fear, something closer to certainty, as though he knew something important. By 3 o'clock, the fete was in full swing. The church itself had been opened to visitors. Many wandered through the cool stone building to admire old memorials and stained glass windows. Arthur Bellamy was among them. He spent nearly an hour examining the church tower staircase. Twice he was seen climbing toward the bell chamber. Several villagers remarked upon it. No one thought it significant. After all, Arthur Bellamy was forever investigating historical curiosities. At 4:30, clouds began gathering overhead. A distant rumble of thunder echoed across the hills. The fete organizers debated whether to move some activities indoors. Then something happened. The church bell rang. One loud, startling note. Clang. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. Another note followed. Clang. Then silence. The sound echoed across the village. People exchanged puzzled looks. The bell mechanism had supposedly been disconnected weeks earlier. The Reverend Harcourt frowned. "That's odd." Before anyone could comment further, a scream shattered the afternoon. It came from inside the church, high, terrified. Instantly the crowd surged toward the entrance. Miss Marple rose slowly from her chair. Unlike everyone else, she did not hurry. People running toward excitement rarely saw anything clearly. Inside the church, confusion reigned. Villagers clustered around the base of the tower staircase. Someone was crying. Someone else was shouting for a doctor. At the center of the crowd lay Arthur Bellamy, dead, or very nearly so. A dark stain spread across the stone floor beneath him. His body was twisted unnaturally. The village doctor knelt beside him. After only a brief examination, he looked up grimly. "I'm afraid he's gone." Silence swept through the church. Reverend Harcourt crossed himself. Mrs. Finch burst into tears. Several people began talking all at once. "He must have fallen." "From the staircase?" "No, from the tower. I heard the bell ring. What was he doing up there?" Miss Marple remained near the back. Her gaze moved carefully across the scene. Arthur Bellamy's body, the staircase, the faces surrounding him, and then something else, something very small, something resting near the dead man's hand. Most people never noticed it. Miss Marple did. A fragment of blue ribbon, no longer than an inch. It appeared entirely insignificant, which was exactly why it interested her. The police arrived from the nearby town before evening. The investigation began immediately. Inspector Graham Fletcher, a capable but occasionally impatient officer, took charge. His first conclusion seemed obvious. Arthur Bellamy had fallen from the bell tower. Whether accidentally or intentionally remained unclear. Witnesses confirmed seeing him enter the tower. No one had seen him come down. The case appeared straightforward. Yet Miss Marple found herself looking once more toward the ancient staircase. She was thinking not about evidence, not about fingerprints, not about footprints. Instead, she was thinking about people, about Sir Malcolm's expression, about Arthur Bellamy's certainty, about the bell that should not have rung, and about the curious fact that someone who had just discovered a dangerous secret might be far more likely to be pushed than to fall. As dusk settled over St. Ethelbury, the church bell remained silent, but the mystery it had announced was only beginning. And somewhere in the village, a murderer believed they were perfectly safe. Chapter 2. Whispers Beneath the Yew Tree. The death of Arthur Bellamy cast a shadow over St. Ethelbury that lingered long after the summer fete had been abandoned. By evening, the bunting still fluttered across the village green, but it now seemed strangely out of place. Half-finished cups of tea remained on tables. Prize ribbons hung untouched. The cheerful noise of the afternoon had vanished, replaced by hushed conversations behind curtains and over garden fences. As Miss Marple often observed, a village could keep a secret for years, but it could never keep silent for long. By the following morning, every resident of St. Ethelbury had a theory, and most of them were wrong. The Blue Boar Inn was unusually crowded. Villagers gathered in clusters, exchanging information with the confidence of people who possessed very little of it. "He slipped," declared Mr. Wilkes, the butcher. "Nonsense," replied Mrs. Finch immediately. "Arthur Bellamy was careful as a cat, never slipped in his life. Then perhaps he climbed somewhere he shouldn't. Why would he?" Mr. Wilkes lowered his voice dramatically. "Looking for treasure." Several people laughed, but not everyone. Arthur Bellamy had spent years researching village history. Rumors occasionally surfaced about hidden valuables concealed during the Civil War, forgotten church relics, or documents hidden away by wealthy families. The stories were usually dismissed. Yet now they returned with renewed enthusiasm. At a nearby table, young Peter Morton spoke quietly to his fiancée. "They'll talk themselves in circles for weeks." His fiancée, Emily Carter, nodded. "People are frightened." "Of what?" She glanced toward the church tower visible through the inn window. "Of not knowing." Meanwhile, Inspector Graham Fletcher had begun conducting interviews. The temporary police office had been established inside a room adjoining the village hall. The inspector sat opposite Reverend Julian Harcourt. "You say the bell mechanism was disconnected?" "Yes." "Completely?" The Reverend hesitated. "Well, not entirely. It was unstable. We restricted its use until repairs could be completed." Inspector Fletcher made a note. "Then it could still be rung, in theory." The inspector looked up. "By someone inside the bell chamber?" "Certainly." Another note joined the growing collection. The bell's mysterious ringing suddenly seemed less mysterious, yet it remained troubling. Why would Arthur Bellamy ring it? And why moments before his death? At Ashcombe Hall, Sir Malcolm Ashcombe appeared more irritated than grief-stricken. His housekeeper, Mrs. Keating, noticed it immediately. Sir Malcolm spent breakfast staring out the window toward the village. His coffee grew cold. His newspaper remained unread. Finally, he pushed away his plate. "Have the police contacted me yet?" "No, sir." "They will." Mrs. Keating said nothing. She had worked at Ashcombe Hall for nearly 30 years. Experience had taught her that Sir Malcolm disliked surprises, and Arthur Bellamy's death appeared to have surprised him greatly. That afternoon, Miss Marple took a slow walk through the churchyard. Ancient gravestones leaned at curious angles. Birdsong drifted through the warm air. Near the southern wall stood an enormous yew tree, older than any living resident of St. Ethelbury. Its dark branches cast deep shadows across the grass. Miss Marple paused beneath it. She had not come there by accident. The churchyard offered an excellent view of both the church entrance and the tower. More importantly, it offered solitude, or so she thought. A voice interrupted her thoughts. "Miss Marple." She turned. Emily Carter approached carrying a basket. The young woman seemed nervous. "Good afternoon, my dear." Emily hesitated. "I was wondering whether I might ask you something." "Of course." Emily glanced toward the church. "Do you think Arthur Bellamy was murdered?" Miss Marple considered the question. "I think it is wise not to decide too quickly. Everyone else already has." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That is usually the difficulty." Emily smiled faintly. Then her expression changed. "There was something odd yesterday." Miss Marple became attentive. "What sort of odd thing?" "I saw Arthur arguing with someone." "Before the fete?" "About an hour before." "Who was it?" Emily shook her head. "I couldn't see clearly. They were near the side entrance of the church." "Was it a man?" "I believe so." "Did you hear anything?" "Only one sentence." Miss Marple waited patiently. Emily lowered her voice. "Arthur said, 'You can't hide it forever.'" For several moments neither spoke. A breeze stirred the branches overhead. Finally, Miss Marple nodded. "Thank you, my dear." Emily looked relieved. "Do you think it matters?" Miss Marple gazed toward the church tower. "People rarely argue about things that do not matter." Later that evening, Inspector Fletcher received another curious piece of information. A search of Arthur Bellamy's cottage revealed dozens of notebooks. Most contained historical research, old maps, family records, copies of parish documents, nothing unusual. Until a constable discovered a notebook hidden inside a desk drawer. Several pages had been torn out. The remaining pages contained repeated references to church records. And one phrase appeared several times. "The bell knows." Inspector Fletcher stared at the words. "The bell knows." It sounded less like research and more like a riddle. Unfortunately, Arthur Bellamy was no longer available to explain it. The following morning, the inspector visited Miss Marple. He found her tending roses. "Good morning, Miss Marple." "Inspector," he smiled, "I suspect you've already heard half the village gossip." "Only half? Perhaps 3/4. Miss Marple laughed softly. Inspector Fletcher described the notebook. "The bell knows," he repeated. "Interesting. You don't seem surprised. History has a habit of hiding itself in strange places." The inspector studied her carefully. "Do you have any theories?" "Oh no." This answer sounded entirely innocent. The inspector knew better. Miss Marple continued clipping a rose stem. "I merely find it curious that a historian would focus so much attention on a church bell. You think he discovered something? Possibly. What? Miss Marple smiled. My dear Inspector, if I knew that, your investigation would be much shorter. That evening, another development unsettled the village. A workman inspecting the church tower made an unexpected discovery. One of the stone steps near the upper section of the staircase had been deliberately damaged. A section of its edge had recently broken away. Inspector Fletcher examined it personally. At first glance, it appeared capable of causing a fall. The findings seemed to support the theory of an accident. Word spread rapidly. By nightfall, many villagers believed the mystery solved. Arthur Bellamy had climbed the tower. The damaged step had given way. He had fallen. A tragic accident, nothing more. Yet Inspector Fletcher remained uncertain. Several details continued to trouble him. The argument, the ringing bell, the missing notebook pages, and Arthur Bellamy's repeated references to a secret. Accidents rarely created so many questions. As darkness settled over St. Ethelbury, Miss Marple sat beside her window knitting. Her needles moved steadily. Her thoughts moved faster. She reflected upon every conversation she had heard since the fete, every expression, every hesitation, every inconsistency. The village believed it was discussing Arthur Bellamy. In reality, she suspected they were unknowingly discussing someone else entirely. A person whose behavior had changed since the death. A person growing increasingly anxious. Miss Marple's eyes drifted toward the distant silhouette of the church tower. The bell, the secret, the missing pages. They were connected. She felt certain of it. Yet certainty and proof were very different things. Outside, the village slept uneasily beneath gathering clouds. And somewhere in the darkness, someone was beginning to fear that Arthur Bellamy had not been the only person who knew the truth. A truth hidden for years, perhaps decades. A truth buried so deeply that one man had already died because of it. And before long, another dangerous discovery would shake St. Ethelbury once again. Chapter 3. The Missing Pages. The morning after the damaged church step was discovered brought a strange stillness to St. Ethelbury. Not the comforting stillness of an ordinary village day, but something more deliberate, as though the entire place were holding its breath. The news had spread quickly. By breakfast, every household knew that Arthur Bellamy's death might have been caused by a fall, and by mid-morning, most villagers had already decided they understood exactly what had happened. People preferred neat explanations. They made life easier. Miss Marple, however, had never found life particularly interested in being neat. At the Blue Boar Inn, the conversation had taken on a more confident tone. "A broken step," said Mr. Wilkes triumphantly, as if he had personally discovered it. "Well, there you are. Case closed." Mrs. Finch was less convinced. "Funny it only broke after he fell." "Coincidence," said Mr. Wilkes. "There's no such thing," Mrs. Finch replied briskly. At the far end of the room, Peter Morton stirred his tea without interest. Emily Carter, seated beside him, was quieter than usual. "You don't believe it's solved," he said. She shook her head slightly. "No." "Because of what you told Miss Marple?" Emily hesitated. "I keep thinking about his last words," she said. "You can't hide it forever." Peter leaned back. "That could mean anything. That's what frightens me." Miss Marple was not at the inn that morning. Instead, she was visiting Arthur Bellamy's cottage. The constable on duty had allowed her entry with a mixture of politeness and mild confusion. Everyone in St. Ethelbury knew Miss Marple. Most assumed she was harmless. It was an assumption that had served many guilty people well in the past. The cottage was modest, lined with shelves of books and neatly stacked papers. Everything appeared ordered, but not in a casual way. It was the order of someone who believed that disorder might conceal something important. Miss Marple moved slowly through the room. She opened drawers carefully. She examined book spines. She noted the position of furniture, the worn paths on the carpet, the faint dust patterns, suggesting where Arthur Bellamy had spent most of his time. Human beings, she often thought, revealed themselves not in what they said, but in what they repeatedly touched. On the desk lay a single fountain pen. Beside it, an empty notebook cover. No pages inside. Miss Marple's gaze lingered. "Interesting," she murmured softly. Inspector Fletcher arrived shortly afterward. "I hope you're not disturbing evidence," he said lightly. "I would never disturb evidence," Miss Marple replied. "Only understanding." The inspector glanced around. "We've confirmed the missing pages from the notebook were torn out deliberately." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That suggests he removed something before his death. Or someone removed it after," she added gently. Fletcher frowned. "We've secured the cottage. No signs of forced entry." "That is reassuring," said Miss Marple. He looked at her. "You don't sound convinced." Miss Marple folded her hands. "My dear Inspector, reassurance and truth are not always the same thing." They examined the remaining books together. Most contained historical research about St. Ethelbury's Church, parish records, old bell maintenance logs, accounts of repairs dating back centuries. But one folder stood out. It contained handwritten notes in Arthur Bellamy's careful script. Repeated references appeared again. "The bell knows." Inspector Fletcher tapped the page. "I still don't understand this." "Nor do I," said Miss Marple. "Not yet, but it must refer to something specific. Human beings do not usually write riddles unless they expect someone to solve them," she replied. "Or fear that someone already has." Later that afternoon, they visited the church tower. The staircase was narrow, winding tightly upward within the ancient stone walls. Each step felt uneven underfoot, centuries of wear making the climb slightly treacherous. Inspector Fletcher examined the damaged step again. "It was weakened deliberately," he said. "Or repaired badly in the past," Miss Marple suggested. "That seems unlikely." "Human negligence is often more likely than human malice," she replied calmly. They reached the bell chamber. The space was dark, dusty, and filled with the faint metallic scent of old iron. The bell itself hung motionless, massive, silent. The rope system had been partially dismantled. Fletcher inspected it carefully. "This could still be used," he said, "if someone knew how." Miss Marple stepped closer to the bell. Her eyes moved slowly over its surface. "There is something curious about bells," she said. "Oh?" "They remember vibrations, long after the sound has stopped." The inspector gave her a puzzled look. "I'm not sure that's scientific." "No," said Miss Marple. "It is not scientific. It is human." That evening brought another development. A second argument had been reported, this time between Sir Malcolm Ashcombe and Reverend Harcourt. It took place inside the church vestry, behind closed doors, but Mrs. Finch's niece had been passing and overheard raised voices. "Should never have been mentioned," Sir Malcolm was heard saying. "You cannot simply ignore it," the Reverend replied. After that, the voices dropped too low to distinguish words, but the tone was unmistakable, fearful, angry, and, according to the niece, like two men arguing over something that might destroy them both. Inspector Fletcher visited Ashcombe Hall the next morning. Sir Malcolm received him in his study. He appeared composed, but there was a tightness around his eyes that had not been there before. "I assume this is about Bellamy," he said. "Yes," said the inspector. "I had little to do with the man." "You knew him?" Sir Malcolm hesitated. "Yes, in passing." The inspector studied him. Arthur Bellamy's notes suggested otherwise. "Did he ever approach you about church records?" Sir Malcolm's expression hardened slightly. "Many people approach me about many things." "That is not an answer," Fletcher said evenly. A pause. Then Sir Malcolm sighed. "If he did, it was of no importance. People rarely die over things of no importance." The words hung in the air. Sir Malcolm's gaze sharpened. "Are you suggesting my involvement?" "I am suggesting nothing yet," said Fletcher. "Only collecting facts." Miss Marple, who had been quietly observing from the corner of the room at Sir Malcolm's invitation, said nothing. But she noticed everything. The slight tightening of Sir Malcolm's hands, the brief flicker of irritation when Arthur Bellamy's name was spoken, and something else, a hesitation that lasted just a fraction too long. When they left Ashcombe Hall, Fletcher exhaled sharply. "He's hiding something," he said. "Most people are," Miss Marple replied. "That doesn't make him a murderer." "No," she agreed. "But it does make him a man under strain. From guilt, from fear," she corrected softly. That night, rain fell over St. Ethelbury. The church tower loomed dark against the sky. Inside his cottage, Inspector Fletcher reviewed the case files again. Broken step, missing notebook pages, bell mechanism, argument overheard. The phrase repeated, "The bell knows." None of it fit together cleanly, and yet everything felt connected, like pieces of a puzzle missing its final shape. Across the village, Miss Marple sat by her window once more. The knitting in her lap remained untouched. Her thoughts, however, were not idle. She was thinking about human behavior, about secrecy, about the peculiar way people guarded not just their actions, but their reputations. Arthur Bellamy had not been a careless man. He had been precise, deliberate, a man who had found something worth risking his life for. The question was no longer what he knew. It was who else knew he knew. Outside, thunder rolled softly across the hills, and in the distance, the church bell tower stood silent. But Miss Marple had the distinct impression that silence, in this case, was not absence, it was restraint, as though something inside the tower was waiting, patiently, carefully, for the right moment to ring again. Chapter 4. The Man Who Knew Too Much. The rain had passed by morning, but St. Ethelbury did not feel refreshed by it. Instead, the village seemed washed into a duller version of itself, hedges heavier, roads darker, and the church tower rising above it all like a patient accusation. The bell remained silent. That silence, Miss Marple reflected, was beginning to feel almost deliberate. At the Blue Boar Inn, the atmosphere had shifted again. The broken step theory, once accepted with enthusiasm, was now being questioned with the same enthusiasm. "If it was an accident," said Mrs. Finch, "why was Arthur Bellamy in the bell chamber at all?" "To ring the bell," Mr. Wilkes suggested stubbornly. "Why would he do that before climbing down?" she countered. "Celebration," someone offered weakly. No one believed it. Even Peter Morton, usually indifferent to village speculation, frowned into his tea. "It doesn't feel like an accident anymore," he said quietly. Emily Carter nodded. It never did. Inspector Fletcher had returned to the church tower early that morning. He climbed alone this time, his footsteps echoing in the narrow stone stairwell. Halfway up he paused. The broken step had been marked with chalk. The surrounding wood and stone had been carefully photographed. Yet something about the space still unsettled him. Not what was there, what was absent. Arthur Bellamy had been a cautious man, careful, precise, methodical. So why had he climbed the tower so freely? And why had he rung the bell? At the top, the bell chamber was colder than before. A faint breeze moved through unseen gaps in the stonework, carrying the smell of wet earth and iron. Fletcher studied the bell mechanism again. The ropes, partially dismantled, hung in uneven lengths. One rope in particular caught his attention. It was frayed in a way that did not look accidental, as though it had been handled repeatedly in a short span of time. He made a note, then another, then paused. Behind him, a voice spoke softly. "You are looking at it, as though it is the bell that matters." Fletcher turned. Miss Marple stood at the top of the stairs, breathing only slightly heavier than usual. "I didn't hear you come in," he said. "I didn't wish to interrupt your thoughts," she replied. "That is difficult in a bell tower. Not for those who are used to listening more than speaking." The inspector gave a faint smile. "You believe I am looking in the wrong direction?" "I believe," said Miss Marple gently, "that most people look at the loudest object in the room first." Fletcher glanced at the bell. "It is rather difficult to ignore." "Yes," she agreed, "and therefore very useful to someone who wishes to distract attention." They descended together. Outside, the churchyard was damp, the air cool and still. Fletcher spoke first. "We may have a new witness." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Oh? A man who lives near the North Lane claims he saw someone in the tower shortly before Bellamy arrived. That is useful. It might be." There was a pause. "He describes the figure as tall," Fletcher continued. "Dark coat, hat pulled low." "That describes half the village gentleman," Miss Marple said lightly. "Exactly," said Fletcher. They walked slowly beneath the yew trees. "Did he see anything else?" she asked. "He said the person was carrying something." "Something?" "A small object wrapped in cloth." Miss Marple stopped walking. "And he is certain of this?" "As certain as memory allows," Fletcher replied. "But he admits he only saw the figure for a few seconds." Miss Marple resumed walking. "Human memory is an interesting thing," she said. "Unreliable, you mean?" "Not necessarily unreliable," she corrected, "but selective." That afternoon, another layer of unease spread through St. Ethelbury. A second notebook belonging to Arthur Bellamy had been found. This time, not in his cottage, but inside the vestry of the church, hidden behind a loose panel. Inspector Fletcher examined it with growing frustration. The pages were fewer than expected, and again, several were missing, but one line had been underlined repeatedly. "He will not allow the truth to surface." Fletcher exhaled sharply. "Bellamy wasn't just studying history," he muttered. "He was afraid of something." Miss Marple, standing beside him, nodded. "Fear is often a stronger motivator than curiosity." Then he discovered something dangerous. "Or believed he had," she said softly. The Reverend Harcourt was questioned again that evening, this time more firmly. He looked increasingly worn, his earlier composure fraying. "I told you," he said, rubbing his forehead. "Arthur Bellamy was obsessed with the church records." "Obsessed with what exactly?" Fletcher pressed. "With discrepancies." "Discrepancies?" "Yes. Old burial records, altered entries, gaps in the archive." Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, looked up. "Gaps," she repeated. The Reverend nodded. He believed something had been removed. "Removed by whom?" Fletcher asked. A long pause followed. "I do not know," Harcourt admitted. But his hesitation said more than his words. Later, Miss Marple walked alone through the village. The rain had left everything glistening faintly. Windows reflected distorted versions of the street. Behind curtains, she knew people were watching, thinking, fearing. She paused near the village green. The church tower was visible beyond the rooftops, and for the first time she allowed herself a more defined thought. Arthur Bellamy had not been searching for treasure. He had been searching for absence. Something that should have been recorded, but was not. Or something that had been deliberately erased. And someone in St. Ethelbury had gone to considerable lengths to ensure that remained true. At Ashcombe Hall that night, Sir Malcolm Ashcombe did not sleep. He paced his study repeatedly. Mrs. Keating, passing quietly outside the door, heard him speaking once to himself. That damned man should have left it alone. Then silence. Then again. He should never have gone into the tower. Mrs. Keating did not enter. She had learned long ago that Sir Malcolm's private thoughts were often safest left undisturbed. Inspector Fletcher met Miss Marple again the following morning. He looked tired. "You were right," he said without preamble. "About what, my dear Inspector?" "This isn't an accident." Miss Marple did not appear surprised. "What changed your mind?" He held up the latest report. The rope system in the bell chamber was tampered with twice. Twice? Yes. Once to weaken it, and once more recently to adjust it. Miss Marple's expression grew thoughtful. "Adjustment suggests intention," she said. "Yes, but I cannot yet see the purpose." "Then perhaps," she said gently, "you are still looking at the wrong part of the mechanism." Fletcher studied her carefully. "You seem to know more than you are saying." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I know only what people are willing to reveal without speaking." "That sounds like guesswork." "It is observation," she corrected. That evening brought a final unsettling discovery. A small piece of cloth was found lodged near the bell mechanism. Dark fabric, expensive quality. Possibly from a coat. Inspector Fletcher held it carefully. "This could belong to our witness description," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "Or," she added softly, "it could belong to the person who wished that description to exist." Fletcher looked sharply at her. "You think someone staged what the witness saw?" "I think," she replied, "that people are often very creative when they wish to guide attention away from themselves." As night settled over St. Ethelbury once more, the village felt less like a community and more like a collection of secrets held together by habit. Miss Marple returned to her window. The knitting remained unfinished. Her thoughts, however, were increasingly complete. Arthur Bellamy had discovered something hidden in plain sight. Something in the church records. Something connected to the bell. And something that at least one person in the village believed was worth killing for. The only question that remained was no longer what happened, it was who had shaped the story everyone was now being asked to believe. Outside, the church bell tower stood unmoving. But Miss Marple now understood something important. A bell did not need to ring to influence a village. Sometimes, silence was the most effective sound of all. Chapter 5. The Records of Absence. By the 5th day after Arthur Bellamy's death, St. Ethelbury had settled into a strange rhythm. The initial shock had faded. Theories had multiplied, overlapped, and contradicted one another so often that villagers now spoke with a kind of cautious certainty, as though agreement itself might be dangerous. The broken step explanation still survived, but only in fragments, like a story repeatedly retold until its edges had worn thin. And always, beneath it all, lingered the same unanswered questions. Why the bell had rung, why Arthur Bellamy had been in the tower, and why certain pages from his notebooks had disappeared entirely. At the church, Inspector Fletcher stood in the vestry with Reverend Harcourt, staring down at the parish records. Rows of neatly bound books stretched back over centuries. Births, marriages, burials, the kind of orderly documentation that gave people comfort in the idea that life itself could be recorded and contained. Fletcher ran a finger lightly over one volume. "This section has been accessed recently," he said. The Reverend nodded reluctantly. "Arthur Bellamy spent days here before the fete, and after. No one else is permitted access without supervision. Yet pages are missing," Fletcher said. The Reverend looked uneasy. "That is what he claimed, that something had been removed." "Did you check?" "Yes." "And?" A pause. "There are gaps," Harcourt admitted. Miss Marple, standing near the window, turned slightly. "Gaps again," she said softly. The word seemed to trouble her more than it should have. Fletcher opened the record book carefully. The pages were old, ink faded in places, ink darker in others, where entries had been corrected. But what caught his attention was not what was written, it was what was missing. Between 2 decades of burials, there was a discontinuity, a year that appeared unusually sparse, not empty, but incomplete. "This year," Fletcher said, tapping it. The Reverend leaned in. "It was a difficult period," he said vaguely. "For the village, for the church," Harcourt corrected quickly. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened slightly. "Difficult how?" The Reverend hesitated. "There were administrative changes. Changes to burial records," Fletcher asked. "Yes, the system was revised." "Revised," Miss Marple repeated. Her tone was gentle, but something in it made the Reverend uncomfortable. "Yes," he said more firmly. "Records were standardized." Fletcher closed the book slowly. "And Arthur Bellamy believed something was removed. That is what he said," Harcourt admitted. "What exactly?" Fletcher pressed. The Reverend shook his head. "I do not know." But again, the answer felt incomplete in a different way. Not ignorance, avoidance. Outside, the churchyard was bright with afternoon light. Miss Marple walked slowly beside Fletcher. "You noticed something?" he said. "Yes," she replied. "And you are not going to tell me?" I am not yet certain what I have noticed, she corrected gently. Fletcher sighed. That is becoming a pattern. Miss Marple smiled faintly. It is a necessary one. They paused beneath the yew tree. Its shadow stretched long across the grass. I do not understand the significance of the records, Fletcher said. Even if something was removed, how does that connect to Bellamy's death? Miss Marple looked toward the church tower. It depends, she said, on what was worth hiding. And you think it was worth killing for? I think, she replied carefully, that some people behave as though it is. That afternoon brought an unexpected visitor to the village. A woman arrived by train, dressed in dark grey, carrying a small leather case. She introduced herself at the inn as Miss Lydia Crane, a historian from London. She requested access to Arthur Bellamy's remaining notes. Her arrival immediately stirred speculation. She's from the university, Mrs. Finch whispered. Or the police, Mr. Wilkes suggested. Or his family, someone else added. But Lydia Crane corrected none of it. She simply asked questions, precise ones, about Bellamy's research, about the church records, about the bell. Inspector Fletcher met her later that day. You worked with Bellamy? He asked. Not directly, she replied. We corresponded. About what? The church archives. Miss Marple, seated quietly nearby, watched her carefully. Lydia Crane had the manner of someone accustomed to being believed, and the habit of measuring her words. He was close to something important, Crane said. What kind of something? Fletcher asked. She hesitated. Something missing, she said at last. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Missing again, she murmured. Crane nodded. Entire entries, not just Bellamy's theory. I confirmed discrepancies myself in older records held in London. Fletcher leaned forward. And what do you believe was removed? Lydia Crane looked toward the church window. Someone's identity. Silence settled heavily in the room. Later that evening, Fletcher reviewed the parish timeline again. A particular period stood out. A cluster of entries that had been rewritten at some point in the past. Names altered. Dates adjusted. Burial records rewritten with unusual consistency. It was not random. It was controlled. Miss Marple, standing beside him, said quietly, Someone very careful did this. Yes, Fletcher agreed. But why? To preserve something, she said. Or conceal it. Sometimes those are the same thing. That night, Lydia Crane remained in the village. She stayed at the inn, requesting further access to church documents in the morning. But late that evening, something disturbed the quiet rhythm of St. Ethelbury again. A light was seen in the church tower, moving, flickering, then disappearing. A villager reported it to the innkeeper in a whisper. Someone is up there again, she said. Inspector Fletcher was alerted immediately. By the time he reached the church, the tower was dark, but the rope system had been disturbed again, not significantly, but enough to suggest recent handling. Fletcher clenched his jaw. This is not coincidence anymore, he muttered. Miss Marple arrived shortly afterward. She surveyed the scene calmly. You think someone returned? She asked. I know they did, Fletcher said. And they changed something. Not enough to see clearly what. Miss Marple stepped closer to the bell mechanism. Her gaze lingered on the ropes. They are becoming careless, she observed. Or more confident, Fletcher suggested. No, she said softly. Careless. That distinction mattered. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused at the base of the staircase. Inspector, she said. Yes? If you remove enough pages from a book, she continued gently, you do not destroy the story. Fletcher frowned. You obscure it. Exactly. And you think Bellamy was close to restoring what was removed? I think, she said carefully, he was close to making it visible again. Fletcher exhaled slowly. And someone stopped him. Yes. A pause. And will likely attempt to stop anyone else who gets too close. That night, St. Ethelbury slept uneasily. Lydia Crane locked her door twice. Inspector Fletcher reviewed every note again. And Miss Marple sat by her window, her knitting untouched, her attention fixed far beyond the visible village. She was no longer thinking only about Arthur Bellamy. She was thinking about what kind of secret could survive for decades inside a church record. Not a crime of passion, not a sudden violence, but something older, organized, preserved, and protected. Outside, the church tower stood silent once more. But silence, Miss Marple now understood, was not emptiness. It was maintenance, and someone in St. Ethelbury had been maintaining a secret for a very long time. Chapter 6. The Visitor from London. The arrival of Lydia Crane had unsettled St. Ethelbury more than the villagers cared to admit. Not because she was loud or intrusive, quite the opposite. She moved through the village with a quiet efficiency that made people feel as though they were being observed, even when she was not present. And in St. Ethelbury, being observed was almost as disturbing as being accused. By the second morning of her stay, conversations in the Blue Boar Inn had changed direction. No longer focused on Arthur Bellamy's death alone, they now circled around the stranger from London. Too interested in the church records, Mrs. Finch whispered. Always asking about missing entries, Mr. Wilkes added. Like she already knows what she's looking for, said Peter Morton quietly. Emily Carter said nothing, but she watched the church tower whenever it came into view. Miss Marple observed Lydia Crane from a distance. She had not yet formed a conclusion about her. That, in itself, was noteworthy. Miss Marple usually formed impressions very quickly. But Lydia Crane resisted easy categorization. She was intelligent, certainly, careful, and unlike many outsiders, she did not underestimate the village. That alone made her more interesting. Inspector Fletcher met Crane again that morning inside the church vestry. The parish records were laid out across the table in orderly stacks. "I've confirmed the discrepancies," Crane said without preamble. Fletcher raised an eyebrow. "Confirmed?" "With duplicates held in London archives." Miss Marple, seated nearby, looked up slightly. "So the records here have been altered," she said. Crane nodded. "Yes, systematically." "For how long?" Fletcher asked. "At least 50 years, Crane replied. Silence followed. 50 years was not a mistake. It was policy. Fletcher leaned back slowly. "That is a very long time for an error to go unnoticed." "It was not unnoticed," Crane said. Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "You mean it was accepted?" "I mean, it was maintained," Crane corrected. The word hung in the air. Maintained, like something fragile that required constant care, or something dangerous that required constant control. "What exactly was altered?" Fletcher asked. Crane opened a folder and placed it on the table. "Certain burial entries," she said. "Names removed, others reassigned." "Reassigned?" Fletcher repeated. "Yes, individuals recorded under different identifiers in official church logs." Miss Marple folded her hands. "That is very precise manipulation." Crane nodded. "It had to be. Otherwise it would have been detected." Fletcher frowned. "But why go to such lengths? What could possibly require that level of concealment?" Crane hesitated. "That," she said, "is what Bellamy was trying to determine." At the mention of Arthur Bellamy's name, a slight silence fell. Miss Marple noticed it immediately. Not grief, not even hesitation, something closer to caution, as though speaking his name too freely might disturb something still active. After the meeting, Fletcher and Miss Marple walked through the churchyard. The sky was overcast again, the light muted. "You trust her?" Fletcher asked. "I do not distrust her," Miss Marple replied carefully. "That is not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "It is not." Fletcher glanced at her. "Then what do you think she is doing here?" "Exactly what she says she is doing," Miss Marple said. "And that worries you?" Miss Marple stopped walking for a moment. "Inspector," she said gently, "when people tell the truth too easily, it is often because they have decided which truth to tell." They paused near the yew tree again. The church tower loomed beyond it. "I cannot yet connect the altered records to Bellamy's death," Fletcher admitted. "Nor should you force the connection too quickly," Miss Marple replied. That is easier said than done. Yes, she agreed. It usually is. A pause. But I believe Arthur Bellamy found something in those records, she continued. What? Not a single entry, she said slowly. A pattern, Fletcher frowned. A pattern of what? That is what we must understand, she replied. Later that afternoon, Lydia Crane requested to examine the church bell chamber. Fletcher agreed reluctantly. Miss Marple accompanied them. The climb felt the same as before. Narrow stone steps, damp air, the faint smell of old wood and iron. But the atmosphere was different. Crane examined the mechanism with professional precision. The adjustments were not random, she said. Fletcher crossed his arms. You can tell that. Yes, she replied. This was done by someone who understood the system fully. Miss Marple watched her quietly. And also, she added softly, by someone who had access over time. Crane nodded. Repeated access would be necessary for this level of manipulation. Fletcher looked between them. So we are looking for someone with knowledge of the bell system. And patience, Miss Marple said. Crane added, and authority. That last word lingered slightly longer than the others. As they descended, Fletcher spoke quietly. Authority could mean many people in this village. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. Reverend Harcourt? Possibly. Sir Malcolm Ashcombe? Also possible. Crane said nothing, but her expression tightened slightly. Miss Marple noticed. That evening, Lydia Crane returned to the inn earlier than usual. Miss Marple saw her speaking briefly with the innkeeper before going upstairs. She seemed preoccupied, distracted in a way she had not been before. Fletcher, meanwhile, spent the evening reviewing parish maps again. He had begun drawing connections between altered burial entries and property records, land transfers, inheritance shifts. Nothing yet formed a clear picture. But patterns were emerging, uncomfortable ones. At approximately 10:30, a disturbance was reported. A light in the church tower again, flickering, moving, this time more sustained. Fletcher and Miss Marple arrived quickly. The tower was dark by the time they reached it. But something was different. The rope mechanism had been completely reconfigured, not damaged, rearranged. Fletcher stared upward. This is deliberate, he said quietly. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, and whoever did this knows we are close. Yes, she agreed again. A pause. And is becoming more anxious. Inside the bell chamber, Fletcher examined the changes. This is not the same person as before, he muttered. You mean the level of skill has changed? Miss Marple asked. No, the precision is the same, but the intention is different. How so? This feels rushed. Miss Marple looked at the bell. Pressure changes behavior, she said thoughtfully. Whose pressure? That is the question, she replied. As they prepared to leave, they encountered Lydia Crane at the base of the tower. She had returned unexpectedly. Her expression was tense. I saw the light, she said immediately. So did others, Fletcher replied. This is no longer just academic, she said. Miss Marple studied her carefully. No, she agreed softly. It is not. Crane hesitated. I believe Bellamy discovered a falsified identity within the records, she said. Fletcher frowned. An identity? Yes. Someone who should not exist in official documentation, but does. Silence followed. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her eyes sharpened slightly. And this identity, she asked gently, is connected to the church? Crane nodded. Yes. And to the bell system? Another hesitation. I believe so. As they parted ways, Fletcher looked troubled. If that is true, he said, then Bellamy did not die because of what he knew about the past. Miss Marple nodded. He died, she said quietly, because he understood the present. Fletcher looked at her, and someone is still protecting it. Yes. A pause. And becoming more desperate as we approach the truth. That night, St. Ethelbury was quieter than usual, but not peaceful. Miss Marple sat by her window, the knitting untouched once more. Her thoughts were no longer scattered, they were aligning. a falsified identity. Altered burial records, a bell mechanism that required knowledge and repeated access. A man who had discovered a pattern hidden inside absence itself. Arthur Bellamy had not simply been investigating history, he had been decoding it, and someone had stopped him before he could finish. Outside, the church tower stood against the night sky like a patient observer. But Miss Marple now understood something important. It was not watching them. It was watching itself being uncovered. Chapter 7. The Identity That Should Not Exist. By the seventh morning, St. Ethelbury no longer felt like a village merely disturbed by a death. It felt like a place being quietly examined from the inside. People spoke more carefully now. Conversations stopped when certain names were mentioned. Even the weather seemed to pass overhead without interest, as though reluctant to become involved. At the center of it all remained the church records, and the unsettling suggestion that someone, somewhere in those carefully maintained books, did not officially exist. Inspector Fletcher had spent most of the night at his desk. Maps, parish registers, and inheritance records were spread across every available surface. The phrase Lydia Crane had used, an identity that should not exist, had refused to leave his mind. It implied intention, planning, and time. Crimes committed in haste were usually messy, but what they were dealing with here felt patient, deliberate, almost administrative. Miss Marple arrived at the police room shortly after breakfast. Fletcher looked up immediately. "You've seen Crane?" he asked. "No," she replied. "But I have been thinking." "That sounds dangerous," she smiled faintly. "Only to assumptions." Fletcher leaned back in his chair. "We have a problem. I suspect we have several. This one is specific," he said. "If Crane is correct, someone in this village has been officially erased and reassigned within church records." Miss Marple nodded. "Yes. And Bellamy found them, possibly, and was killed for it." Miss Marple paused. "That would be the simplest explanation," she said carefully. Fletcher frowned. "You don't believe it is simple?" "I believe," she replied, "that human beings rarely do something complicated for a simple reason." A knock at the door interrupted them. Lydia Crane entered without waiting for permission. She looked more strained than before. "I've found something else," she said immediately. Fletcher gestured for her to continue. "There is a discrepancy not only in burial records," she said, "but in church staffing logs." Miss Marple's gaze lifted slightly. "Staffing? Yes, there was an assistant verger employed in the late 1950s whose name appears in London records, but not here." Fletcher leaned forward. Meaning, Crane said, "that someone worked in this church for years and was then removed from the official village record entirely." Silence settled heavily. Miss Marple spoke gently. "And this person?" Crane hesitated. "I cannot yet confirm their identity." "But you believe they are the key," Fletcher said. "Yes." Fletcher exhaled slowly. "So Bellamy was trying to reconstruct a person who had been erased." "And that is my conclusion," Crane replied. Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful. "And the bell?" Crane looked at her. "I believe it was part of the system used to conceal the alteration." Fletcher frowned. "The bell as concealment?" "Yes," she said. "Its maintenance records were also adjusted. Times of ringing do not match parish logs in certain years." Miss Marple folded her hands. "So the bell marks something." Crane nodded. "I believe so." Fletcher rubbed his temples. "This is becoming increasingly difficult to follow." Miss Marple replied softly, "It is not meant to be followed easily." Later that morning, they visited the church archives again. Reverend Harcourt appeared visibly uneasy. "I must insist," he said, "that these records remain undisturbed beyond necessary review." "I am afraid that point has already passed," Fletcher replied. Harcourt sighed. "What exactly are you looking for now?" Miss Marple answered instead. "A person who should have existed in your records but does not." The Reverend blinked. "That is not possible." Yet, Miss Marple said gently. Here we are. Inside the archive room, Lydia Crane laid out her findings. She pointed to a series of entries. Here, she said, a gap in employment records. Then another. And here, a burial entry that does not correspond with any name in census data. Fletcher studied them carefully. They have been altered consistently, he said. Yes, Crane confirmed. Miss Marple examined the pages quietly. And the handwriting. Different in some sections, Crane replied, suggesting amendments made at different times. Fletcher frowned. So multiple people were involved. Or one person over a long period, Miss Marple suggested. Crane nodded slowly. That is also possible. A silence followed. Then Fletcher spoke. Why would someone erase a person so thoroughly? No one answered immediately. Miss Marple eventually said, there are only a few reasons people attempt to remove someone from memory entirely. Go on. Shame, she said. Protection. Or fear of consequences. Fletcher looked at her. Which do you think applies here? Miss Marple hesitated. I think, she said carefully, that we are dealing with something that began as protection and became something else. Yes, she said softly. Over time, protection often turns into control. That afternoon, a new piece of information arrived. A retired parish clerk, now living in a neighboring village, had been contacted by Fletcher. He arrived reluctantly, clearly uncomfortable, but after some prompting, he confirmed something unexpected. Yes, he said. There was an assistant verger in those years. Fletcher leaned forward. What was his name? The old man hesitated. I don't remember it clearly. That is convenient, Fletcher said sharply. It is honest, the man replied. Miss Marple intervened gently. Do you remember anything about him? The man frowned. Only that he was very quiet, kept to himself. And then? Fletcher asked. He left, the man said. Left? Yes, suddenly. Did anyone replace him? A pause. I don't think so. Miss Marple exchanged a glance with Fletcher. No replacement, just disappearance. After the man left, Fletcher paced the room. This is getting worse, he muttered. How so? Miss Marple asked. If there was no replacement, then the records were not just altered, they were reconstructed. Yes, which means whoever did it had full access. Yes, she agreed. Fletcher stopped pacing. Reverend Harcourt. Possible, she said. Sir Malcolm? Also possible. Fletcher frowned. But neither explanation feels complete. No, Miss Marple said softly. It does not. That evening, Lydia Crane requested to visit Ashcombe Hall again. Fletcher agreed, though reluctantly. Miss Marple accompanied them. Sir Malcolm received them in his study once more, though his manner was noticeably less composed. Crane spoke first. We believe there was a verger employed here decades ago whose identity has been removed from official records. Sir Malcolm's expression tightened slightly. I fail to see how that concerns me. Miss Marple observed him carefully. It may not concern you directly, she said gently, but it concerns the church of which you are a patron. A pause. Sir Malcolm's gaze shifted briefly, then back. I know nothing of missing employees, he said firmly, but something in his tone lacked conviction, not in truth, in certainty. As they left, Fletcher muttered, He knows more than he is saying. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, and he is becoming uneasy. Yes, because we are close? Closer, she corrected softly, but not close enough yet. That night, another disturbance occurred. A bell rung, only once, a single, clear sound across the sleeping village. Clang, then silence. Fletcher arrived at the church within minutes, Miss Marple shortly after, but no one was found inside. The mechanism had not been fully activated, only partially engaged. A signal, rather than a full ringing. Deliberate. Fletcher stared upward into the bell chamber. This is intentional communication, he said. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. From whom? That, she said softly, is the question that will decide everything. As they stood in the empty church, Lydia Crane arrived breathless. "I know who it is," she said abruptly. Both turned toward her. "The identity that was erased," she said. "I found it." Silence followed. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her eyes sharpened slightly. "And?" she asked gently. Crane hesitated. "It is someone connected to the present leadership of the church." Fletcher's expression hardened. "Reverend Harcourt." Crane shook her head. "No." A pause. "Someone closer than that." The air in the church seemed to shift. Miss Marple looked toward the silent bell above them, and for the first time since the investigation began, she felt something align more sharply than before. Not certainty, but direction. Chapter 8. The Name Beneath the Stone. The bell's single note still seemed to linger in the air long after it had faded. St. Ethelbury, usually so accustomed to the gentle rhythms of rural life, now reacted to sound differently. A closing door felt sharper. A footstep in gravel seemed heavier. Even silence had begun to feel like a deliberate choice rather than a natural absence. Inspector Fletcher stood in the church nave long after Lydia Crane had finished speaking. "Someone closer than that," she had said. The phrase refused to settle. Closer than the Reverend Harcourt. Closer than Sir Malcolm Ashcombe. Closer, perhaps, than anyone in the village was prepared to admit. Miss Marple remained still beside one of the pews, her gaze drifting upward toward the bell chamber. There are very few positions in a village that allow constant contact with church records, she said quietly. Fletcher glanced at her. "You are thinking of church staff?" "I am thinking," she corrected gently, "of someone who moves unnoticed between rooms, archives, and routines." Lydia Crane, standing near the altar rail, folded her arms. "The assistant verger," she said. "That is the identity I have been able to reconstruct." Fletcher turned toward her sharply. "You have a name?" "Not yet fully confirmed," she replied. "But there is something consistent in the fragments." "What fragments?" he asked. "Work logs, payroll slips, parish maintenance notes." Miss Marple's attention sharpened slightly. "And?" Crane hesitated. "A recurring initial appears in marginal corrections." "Oh." Fletcher frowned. "That narrows it down very little." "No," Crane agreed. "But combined with burial records and staff rotation gaps, it suggests a single individual maintaining administrative access over decades." Miss Marple spoke softly. "A custodian of continuity." Crane nodded. "Yes, someone ensuring records remained aligned." Fletcher exhaled. "That could be any number of people over 50 years. Or one person," Miss Marple said again. A silence followed. They left the church together, walking slowly through the damp churchyard. The yew tree stood as always, its dark branches unmoving in the still air. Fletcher broke the silence. "If this assistant verger truly existed in the records," he said, "why would Bellamy focus so intensely on him?" "Because," Miss Marple replied, "he was not simply a worker." Lydia Crane looked at her. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple paused. "Arthur Bellamy was not searching for a missing person," she said gently. "He was searching for a presence that had been carefully disguised as absence." Fletcher frowned. "I still do not understand the significance." "You are trying to see it as a single event," Miss Marple replied. "But it is not a single event. It is a long sequence of adjustments," Crane added quietly. "And someone maintained those adjustments consistently." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "For a very long time." That afternoon, Fletcher insisted on reviewing burial records from the past 60 years in chronological order. The task was painstaking, page after page, entry after entry. At first, nothing appeared unusual, but gradually a pattern emerged. Small corrections, inconsistencies in ink, occasional overwritten names, and then something more disturbing, a series of marginal annotations in the same handwriting. "Not corrections, instructions." Miss Marple leaned closer. "These are not clerical notes," she said softly. "No," Fletcher agreed grimly. "They are guidance." Lydia Crane studied the markings. They appear in multiple decades, she said. Yes, Fletcher replied. Which suggests continuity, Miss Marple added. Crane looked up. Or succession, she said. Fletcher frowned. You mean someone replaced themselves? No, she said carefully. I mean someone ensured their role continued under different identities. Silence followed. Later that evening, Fletcher returned alone to the church. Miss Marple arrived shortly after. The atmosphere inside was different again, heavier, as though the building itself were aware of being examined too closely. Fletcher stood near the altar. I've been thinking about what Crane said, he admitted. Miss Marple joined him quietly. And if this assistant verger maintained records for decades, he said, then he had access to everything. Yes, and knowledge of every alteration. Yes. Fletcher turned to her. So why would Bellamy only recently discover him? Miss Marple's expression softened. Because, she said, the records were designed to be read in a particular way. Fletcher frowned. A controlled narrative. Yes, she said gently. Even in archives. A sudden sound interrupted them. Footsteps above. In the bell chamber. Both looked upward. Fletcher reached for his torch immediately. Stay here, he said. Miss Marple did not move. Instead, she followed. The climb was silent, stone steps worn smooth by centuries of use. The air grew colder with each level. At the top, the bell chamber was dimly lit by a single lantern left burning near the mechanism. Fletcher froze. Someone had been here recently. Not just recently. Moments ago. The ropes had been adjusted again. But more importantly, a small bundle lay on the wooden floor. Miss Marple approached it first, carefully. She knelt and examined it. A page, she said softly. Fletcher stepped closer. It was torn from an old register, but not randomly, deliberately preserved. On it, a name had been partially visible before being erased. Only one fragment remained intact. Fletcher stared. That could be anything, he said. Miss Marple shook her head. It is not the name that matters, she said gently. It is the fact that it was removed. Crane's earlier words echoed again. The identity that should not exist. Fletcher stood slowly. We are being led, he said. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. By Bellamy? He asked. A pause. Or by the person who killed him, she said quietly. As they descended, Lydia Crane arrived at the tower entrance, breathless again. I heard you come up, she said quickly. She looked shaken. I have something else, she added. Fletcher turned to her. What now? Crane hesitated. I found burial cross-references in land transfer documents. Miss Marple looked at her. Land transfer? Yes, Crane confirmed. Properties in the village changed hands under suspiciously consistent timing with the record alterations. Fletcher frowned. You are saying these changes were not just clerical? No, Crane said. They had financial consequences. A pause. Miss Marple spoke softly. So the erasure of identity was not merely administrative. No, Crane agreed. It was economic, Fletcher said grimly. Crane nodded. And possibly protective. That night, tension settled heavily over St. Ethelbury. Sir Malcolm Ashcombe was seen pacing his study again. Reverend Harcourt reportedly spent hours in prayer. Lydia Crane locked her notes in her room twice, and Inspector Fletcher reviewed every document once more, searching for something he could not yet name. Miss Marple, however, sat quietly by her window. She was no longer assembling fragments. She was watching convergence. And it was becoming increasingly clear that Arthur Bellamy had not uncovered a simple historical inconsistency. He had uncovered a structure, a system, something built carefully over decades to ensure that a single truth remained buried beneath layers of administrative certainty. Outside, the church tower stood in darkness. But for the first time, Miss Marple considered the possibility that the bell was no longer just a signal, it was a warning, and someone in St. Ethelbury had just realized how close they were to being understood. Chapter 9. The pattern in the silence. By the 9th day, the silence in St. Ethelbury had begun to feel structured. It was no longer the natural quiet of a rural village settling into nightfall, but something arranged, deliberate gaps in sound, as though conversation itself was being carefully measured. Even the church bell, once the center of attention, now remained completely still. That stillness, Miss Marple thought, was beginning to resemble restraint. Inspector Fletcher had stopped calling the investigation a simple death. He no longer referred to Arthur Bellamy's fall as probable or accidental in his reports. Instead, he wrote only what could be proven, which, at present, was very little: the broken step, the altered bell mechanism, the missing pages, and now the increasingly disturbing suggestion that an entire identity had been erased from parish history. Lydia Crane arrived at the police room before dawn. Her usual composure had shifted. There was urgency in her movements now, a tension that suggested she was no longer merely observing the case, but being pulled into it. "I've completed the cross-reference analysis," she said immediately. Fletcher looked up from his desk. "And it is worse than we thought." Miss Marple, already present in the room, remained still. "In what way?" she asked gently. Crane placed a bundle of papers on the table. "I found a consistent pattern," she said. "Every alteration in the church records aligns with changes in property ownership within the village." Fletcher frowned. "You mentioned that before." "Yes," Crane replied, "but now I have confirmed something more precise." She pointed to a column of dates. Each significant alteration corresponds with a transfer of land or inheritance adjustment within 6 months. A silence followed. Fletcher leaned forward. "You are suggesting financial benefit." "I am suggesting," Crane said carefully, "that the manipulation of identity directly affected ownership rights." Miss Marple's gaze softened slightly. "So, the erased identity," she said, "was not just hidden." "No," Crane confirmed. "It was redistributed." Fletcher stood slowly. "That implies motive," he said. "Yes," Crane agreed. "A very strong one," he added quietly. Miss Marple folded her hands. "And also suggests," she said gently, "that Arthur Bellamy was not simply uncovering a historical error." Fletcher looked at her. "He was uncovering fraud." Crane nodded. "Yes." A pause. "And someone involved in that system decided he could not continue," Fletcher concluded. Later that morning, they returned to the church together. The building felt colder than before. Not physically, atmospherically. As though it had begun to understand it was no longer merely a place of worship, but the center of scrutiny. Reverend Harcourt met them at the door. "You are disturbing the peace of the parish," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "The peace has already been disturbed," Fletcher replied. Miss Marple stepped forward. "We are trying to understand it," she said gently. Harcourt hesitated. "I have told you everything I know." "I do not doubt that," Miss Marple replied. "But sometimes what people do not say is equally important." Inside the vestry, Lydia Crane reopened the parish registers. "This section," she said, pointing to a cluster of entries, "is where the pattern becomes most visible." Fletcher leaned in. The handwriting changed subtly across years. Different inks, different corrections, but always the same structure, always the same controlled adjustments. Miss Marple studied it quietly. "It is almost like maintenance," she said. Crane nodded. "Yes." Fletcher frowned. "Maintenance of what?" "Of consistency," Crane replied. Miss Marple added softly, "Of belief." A silence followed. Then Fletcher spoke. "So Bellamy was trying to break that consistency." "Yes," Crane said. "And that is why he was killed," Fletcher said. No one disagreed, but Miss Marple's expression remained thoughtful. "Perhaps," she said gently. Fletcher looked at her sharply. "You think there is more?" "I think," she replied, "that people rarely protect a system for only one reason." That afternoon, a new discovery shifted the tone again. A second witness came forward. An elderly woman who had lived near the church all her life. She requested to speak only to Miss Marple. In a small parlour behind the inn, she sat nervously, twisting her hands. "I shouldn't be saying this," she whispered. Miss Marple waited patiently. "I remember the assistant verger," the woman said. Fletcher leaned forward. "You remember him?" "Yes," she replied. "He used to come and go from the church at strange hours." Crane asked softly, "Did he speak to anyone?" The woman shook her head. "No, but I remember something else." "What?" Miss Marple asked. The woman hesitated. "He used to ring the bell at night," she said. Fletcher stiffened. "At night?" "Yes. Not often. Only sometimes. Always alone." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. "And no one questioned it?" The woman shook her head. "No one wanted to." After she left, Fletcher paced the room. "This is no longer just administrative manipulation," he said. "No," Crane agreed. "It has always been more than that," Miss Marple said softly. Fletcher turned to her. "What do you mean?" She hesitated. "People do not maintain silence for decades without reason." A pause. "And what reason do you think this is?" Miss Marple looked toward the window. "I think," she said carefully, "that the bell was not only used to mark time." Fletcher frowned. "Then what was it used for?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet. "To mark moments that needed to be controlled." That evening, Fletcher returned to the church alone. He insisted on inspecting the bell chamber again. Miss Marple arrived shortly afterward. The rope system had been altered once more. But this time, something was different. Not just adjustment, reinforcement. Fletcher stared at it. "Someone is preparing for something," he said. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "But what?" he asked. She looked at the bell for a long moment. "Completion," she said softly. Lydia Crane arrived shortly after, visibly unsettled. "I think I understand the final link," she said. Both turned to her. She hesitated. "The assistant verger," she said slowly, "was not simply maintaining records." Fletcher frowned. "Then what was he doing?" Crane looked at Miss Marple. "He was controlling what the village believed about itself." Silence followed. Miss Marple nodded faintly. "Control of narrative," she said. "Yes," Crane agreed. Fletcher looked between them. "And Bellamy threatened that control." "Yes," Crane said again. A pause. "And now someone is trying to restore it." That night, the bell rang again. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Clear, measured, deliberate. Clang, clang, clang. The sound echoed across St. Ethelbury, like a signal finally delivered. Fletcher ran toward the church immediately. Miss Marple followed. Lydia Crane was already there. But the tower was empty. No movement, no figure. Only the bell swaying slightly in residual motion. Fletcher stared upward. "That is not accidental," he said. "No," Miss Marple agreed quietly. Crane looked shaken. "It is a message," she said. Fletcher turned sharply. "From whom?" Miss Marple did not answer immediately. Instead, she looked at the silent bell as it gradually came to rest, and for the first time, she spoke with certainty rather than speculation. "From someone who believes," she said softly, "that the system is beginning to fail." A silence followed, not peaceful, but anticipatory. As though the village itself now understood that the pattern had reached its final stage, and whatever had been hidden in St. Ethelbury for decades was no longer content to remain silent. Chapter 10. The Bell That Answers Back. The final ringing of the bell did not fade into silence the way earlier sounds had. It seemed instead to settle into the very structure of St. Ethelbury, as though the village itself had absorbed it and was now holding it somewhere beneath thought and breath. Inspector Fletcher arrived at the church with urgency sharpened into certainty. Miss Marple followed at a steadier pace. Lydia Crane was already there, standing beneath the tower arch, her face pale but composed in the way of someone who had reached the end of research and was now confronted with consequence. The bell above them was still, but not innocent. "It has been used again," Fletcher said sharply. "Yes," Crane replied. "And yet no one is here." Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly upward. No one visible, she corrected gently. A silence followed. Then footsteps echoed from the vestry. Reverend Julian Harcourt appeared. His expression was controlled, but there was something strained beneath it, like a surface held too long under pressure. "I was told there was disturbance again," he said. Fletcher turned immediately. "Were you in the tower?" Harcourt hesitated. "No." The pause was slight, but Miss Marple noticed it. Crane stepped forward. "We have completed the reconstruction," she said. Harcourt frowned. "Reconstruction of what?" "Records," Fletcher said. "Identities, adjustments spanning decades." A flicker passed across Harcourt's face. "Parish administration is complex," he replied. "Yes," Miss Marple agreed softly. "It is." Her tone was mild, but her eyes were not. "You must understand," Harcourt continued. "Mistakes accumulate over time." Crane shook her head. "These are not mistakes," she said firmly. "They are controlled alterations." A silence followed. Then Miss Marple spoke. "Control requires continuity," she said gently. Harcourt looked at her. "I do not understand your implication." Miss Marple nodded slightly. "I think," she said, "you understand it very well." Fletcher stepped forward. "We know about the assistant verger," he said. The air in the tower seemed to tighten. Harcourt's expression did not change immediately, but something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly. "That was a long time ago," he said. "Yes," Crane replied, "but the records did not disappear. They were rewritten." Harcourt exhaled slowly. "You are suggesting," he said carefully, "that a church employee decades ago is connected to this death." Miss Marple's voice remained calm. "I am suggesting," she said, "that he did not remain merely an employee." A pause. "And that he did not disappear," she continued. "He evolved." Fletcher frowned. "Into what?" Miss Marple turned her gaze fully toward Harcourt. "Into continuity itself," she said softly. Silence. Then Lydia Crane spoke, her voice steady, but quieter now. "The handwriting," she said. "The marginal corrections, the administrative adjustments, they span decades." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "That would require either multiple people," Crane continued, "or one person maintaining authority across time." Fletcher looked between them. "That is not possible." "It is," Miss Marple said gently, "if the identity was replaced rather than removed." A long silence followed. Then Harcourt spoke again. "You are making an extraordinary accusation." Miss Marple nodded. "I am making an observation," she corrected. She stepped slightly closer. "When Arthur Bellamy examined the burial records," she said, "he did not find missing entries at random." She glanced toward Crane. "He found patterns." Crane nodded. "Yes." "And those patterns," Miss Marple continued, "aligned with property transfers." Fletcher's expression hardened. "Financial manipulation," he said. "Yes," Crane confirmed. Miss Marple turned back to Harcourt. "And the consistency of those manipulations," she added softly, "suggested something more than clerical oversight." A pause. "Something administrative," she said, "with authority." Harcourt did not respond, but his silence had changed. It was no longer neutral, it was defensive. Miss Marple's voice softened further. "There was once an assistant verger," she said, "who understood the church's systems intimately." She paused. "And who had access to records, schedules, and maintenance logs." Crane nodded slowly. "Yes." Miss Marple continued. "And over time, entries were adjusted. Names were altered. Individuals were reassigned within records." Fletcher frowned. "To what end?" Miss Marple looked at him. "To control what the village believed about itself." A silence followed. Then she added quietly, "And, more importantly, what it did not question." Harcourt finally spoke. "You are constructing a narrative from fragments." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "That is what investigation is," Fletcher added. "But fragments can be misleading," Harcourt said. "Only if they are isolated," Miss Marple replied gently. A pause. Once connected, she continued, they form patterns. She looked at him steadily. And patterns reveal intention. Lydia Crane stepped forward. The assistant verger disappeared from official records, she said. But his influence did not. Harcourt's expression tightened. That is speculation. No, Crane said firmly. It is documentation. She placed a final sheet of paper on the stone table. This is the reconstructed identity chain. Fletcher looked down, then went still. Miss Marple observed him carefully. And then she spoke. You see it now, she said softly. Fletcher did not answer immediately. Then slowly he said, It is not a chain. No, Miss Marple agreed. It is a continuation, Fletcher finished. The silence that followed was heavier than any before. Harcourt stepped back slightly. That is impossible, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. Miss Marple looked at him gently. Is it? She asked. A pause. Then she said it. Reverend Julian Harcourt, she said quietly, was once recorded under another identity. Crane's eyes widened slightly. Fletcher stared. Miss Marple continued calmly. An assistant verger, quiet, unremarkable, responsible for maintaining church systems and records. She paused. And responsible, over time, for altering them. Harcourt's face tightened. That is not, but it is, Miss Marple interrupted gently. Not as accusation, as pattern. She stepped closer. When Arthur Bellamy began reconstructing the inconsistencies, she said, he did not simply find financial fraud. She looked at Harcourt steadily. He found you. Silence. Fletcher's voice came low. Why erase your own identity? Miss Marple answered, because it was easier to control the system from within an official position than from the position of someone who was not supposed to exist. Crane added softly, and because once established, the identity of Reverend Harcourt carried authority that the original could not have achieved. Harcourt finally spoke. You are wrong. But the words were quieter now. Miss Marple nodded. I do not think so, she said kindly. She gestured slightly toward the bell. And the bell system, she continued, was not merely symbolic. Fletcher looked up. It was used to coordinate moments of adjustment, Miss Marple said. Crane nodded slowly. Timed record changes, she said. Yes, Miss Marple agreed. And Arthur Bellamy realized this, Fletcher said. Yes, Miss Marple said. And threatened exposure, Crane added. Miss Marple looked at Harcourt. And that is why he was stopped. A long silence followed. The church seemed to hold it. Then Harcourt spoke again, quieter now. He was going to destroy everything. No, Miss Marple said gently. He was going to reveal it. A pause. And some people, she added softly, prefer preservation over truth. Fletcher stepped forward. So you killed him? The question hung. Harcourt did not answer immediately. Then he said, he fell. But no one moved. No one accepted it. Miss Marple looked at him steadily. Arthur Bellamy did not fall accidentally, she said. Nor did he climb alone. She paused. He was lured, she said softly. To confirm what he had already discovered, Crane whispered, the bell ringing. Yes, Miss Marple said. It was a signal, Fletcher said grimly. To bring him to the tower, Miss Marple agreed. And then? Fletcher asked. Miss Marple looked upward. The broken step had already been prepared, she said quietly. A silence followed. Harcourt finally lowered his gaze. I did what was necessary, he said, but his voice lacked strength now. Miss Marple nodded once. That, she said gently, is what most people who maintain long secrets eventually believe. Outside, the wind moved through the churchyard. The bell above them remained still, not silent, but resolved, as though its role in the story had finally been understood. Fletcher closed his notebook slowly. It is over, he said. Miss Marple did not immediately agree. Not entirely, she said softly. He looked at her. Why not? She glanced once more at the tower. Because, she said gently, human nature does not end with a revelation. A pause. but it does become a little harder to disguise. As they left the church, St. Ethelbury felt different, not healed, not restored, but understood in a way it had not been before. Lydia Crane remained behind, gathering her papers. Reverend Harcourt stood alone near the altar, no longer an authority, but something more fragile, a man no longer protected by narrative. Miss Marple walked slowly through the churchyard one final time. The yew tree cast its long shadow across the grass. The village would recover, as villages always did, but something had changed, not in its structure, in its awareness, and Miss Marple, as always, felt no triumph, only recognition of how easily truth could be buried, and how patiently, in the right hands, it could be kept alive.